Rick Revel, Mr. History, brought to you in part by Dixie Gun Works in Union City, Tennessee. Some of the fondest memories that we have during our lifetime comes from our childhood, and that statement certainly applies to me. My granddad, Hughley Revel, who was married to my grandma, Nona, would bring me to this park in McKenzie, Tennessee when I was a little boy. I remember seeing old men sitting on park benches, whittling on wood and carving out tiny statues. Known as Veterans Memorial Park today, I've had the privilege of doing ceremonies here to honor those who fought for our country. The sidewalk is lined with the names of those who served in our military. Although my granddad's name is not listed here, he did fight for his country during the First World War. When I was about 5 years old, my granddad brought me to the park to see this artillery piece. It's been sitting in this very spot since 1929. He said while he was in the Army fighting over in France, the Germans fired at him with artillery pieces just like this. Then a young boy, I clung to his every word. As I began to write this story, I found out that my granddad was right. As I did my research, I discovered that this artillery piece was built in Germany by Krupp Manufacturing. And stamped on the muzzle of the artillery piece are the Latin words Ultima Ratio Regum, which translates into English to say the last argument of kings. Because of my dad and my granddad, I've always had a fascination with all things military. Not far from McKenzie, there's a place that restores weapons of war like this, and that's going to be our next destination on History Highway.
One, two, three. We're gonna drive in every day, and somewhere along the way, there's a road sign with a story from the past. History is everywhere, and I'm gonna take you there. So buckle up tight, we're going there real fast. So take a ride down the History Highway. We're headed right to the days of old. So take a ride down the History Highway. I got the pedal to the metal and I'm letting this Chevy roll.
Here in the reference room at Big Bore, I tell you what, this is the coolest place I've been to in a long time. This is where all things military are restored. Standing next to me is Ira Sellers. He's the owner of Big Bore, and he's going to tell us about some of the World War II items he has here. Let's start with this gun here. I'm really curious about it.
Browning gun, Browning design, Browning 30 caliber. Water-cooled guns. Most of the guns started being water-cooled. Maxim, Browning, whether it's in 30, whether it's in 50. Went to aircraft. That way they could, went to air-cooled. That way they could go ahead and not be hauling around a whole bunch of water and a whole bunch of extra weight and parts.
Right.
So this would have been guns that would have, the design themselves would have started in World War I, pre-World War I, and all of them were used in World War II.
And you told me something crazy about this one a while ago. You said although this was kind of post-World War I and used in World War II some, tell me about what happened in South America with this gun.
The longer jacket versions, water-cooled 50s, were used commonly by the U.S. military. They were a longer jacket, longer gun. So when people look at this, they think it kind of looks different because it does. Most of these are referred to of designations of both as commercial models, the short jacket kind of slimmer line, because they were sold mainly to companies. They were sold to companies, they were sold to mining companies, they were sold to railroad companies. This is basically how you dealt with claim jumpers. This is how you dealt with security in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. When you had somebody that you had to actually go ahead and keep off your property or suppress people, you dealt with it this way.
Kind of like the Thompson machine gun, it kind of got its popularity during civilian times.
Very much so.
So that's kind of interesting. This particular gun, which you think should be just all military, It got quite the
Very much
popularity.
so.
for
It carried
civilians.
that the Colt commercial nomenclature is commonly used for.
Cool beans. I love it. Now this gun, this is the one my producer Ken, he loved it. He was asking you questions about this particular gun, and it kind of surprised me. This is actually an aviation gun.
Yes, it is.
Tell me more about this one.
This is a Hispano, so this is a Hispano Suiza design. The U.S. used them, but mainly the British used them.
Okay.
So Spitfires, Hawker Hurricanes.
Wow.
They were almost generally always used. They were used predominantly more in aircraft than they were for ground mount. There were ground mount situations, usually for naval,
Right.
but they were predominantly an aircraft gun. If you look at even just the unlocking system,
Right.
this right here to charge the gun, there'd be a cable to it. So you would have pneumatic or cable charging. It didn't come with a way to manually charge it.
Now this would be mounted in the wing.
Wing, fuselage, even engine. So root. They
Right.
were used usually if it's going to be mounted on the wings on aircraft
Right.
because the stress to the structure.
Right.
They were usually moved in closer to the fuselage.
Right. Cool beans. And one of the things you promised me sometime we're going to do is have a weenie roast with one of your flamethrowers. Tell me something about the flamethrowers you have here.
Flamethrowers are always something that people pay quite a bit of attention to because they are incredibly visual, whether
Right.
you're running around with them or using them. Flamethrowers, World War II flamethrowers, a lot of the World War II flamethrowers are still floating around now. They were converted to gas. So they used them for tear gas, CS gas, things
Right.
of that nature after the war and stayed in the U.S. Right. So there's actually a lot of U.S. World War II flamethrowers that are still in circulation that were used by PDs. That's a World War II U.S. version, and this one right here is a really rare version. It's an Italian.
It's an Italian version. And
Yep.
wow.
So the Italians had them. The Chinese had a World War II version. Wow. The Germans had one that's just looks like a big donut. Everyone had.
Oh, really?
Yes, big giant donut-looking thing with the pressure tank.
Right.
Which this would be a semi-modern pressure tank.
Right.
So the pressure tank went in the center of that donut. This would be a World War II pressure tank.
Gotcha.
And this is your pressure tank. So that's what holds your pressure that propels your fluid.
Okay. Good.
So everyone had them though. So I mean, it wasn't just one nation had this one. Everyone did a lot of design work during World War II for flamethrowers.
What got you started? What was the love?
Always liked mechanical things, always liked firearms, just in general working with them, being around that stuff. The biggest thing was when you see stuff that's incredibly unique, like aircraft guns. I started a lot of times with aircraft guns.
Right.
People would say, well, this doesn't work, or that doesn't work, or you it's hard to get this.
Right.
Well, why not? Somebody else made it work. How hard could it be?
Sure.
So just starting to work with aircraft guns is probably what started me doing a lot of this.
Could we step out into the shop? I'd like to see what the naval deck guns look like.
Yeah, definitely.
All right, let's do that. You know, earlier we were talking about Camp Tyson and the barrage balloons. Well, out in the big drink, or the ocean there, were naval vessels. And this is some of the deck guns that might have been on some of the naval vessels, on destroyers. And what else was it?
These guns would have been started, the 3-inch 50 design was started in the early 1900s.
Wow.
Right at the end of 1800s, early 1900s. The early marks would have been put out even before World War I. Now everything was pressed into service and used. So they had marks all the way up to Mark 12s. They would have went on everything from your frigates, from escorts, even submarines. They used them for everything. But the early guns, these ones being earlier guns, probably were reserved for those smaller vessels, destroyers, frigates, escorts, things of that nature. Right. But everything had them. Everything had 3-inch 50s. The larger your boat, the larger you could put armament, so they went up to 5-inch and things of that nature. Wow. But these things were backbones. There was, thousands, tens of thousands of these guns made, an enormous amount.
He even has some ordnance that goes with it. Let's take a look at the ordnance.
Sure. Most of these guns, if they were going to be designed as dual-purpose guns,
right.
Almost always they were looking at dual-purpose guns. Most
right.
of these guns are designed as dual-purpose guns no matter what.
Right.
So you would start with an AP round, and then you would have a payload round.
Okay.
And it's funny because even in the U.S. Navy had AP rounds for their 3-inch 50s, and that's what that is. That's an armor-piercing capped round. So they have the cap so it'll fly straight. They have an armor-piercing core so it'll actually pierce before it detonates.
Gotcha. These are just an air bursting round. So you have a thin shell and then an HE payload.
One unique thing about
Okay.
a lot of these rounds is what people don't think about is that's probably something that won the war.
Wow.
Because if you hadn't had a radio fuse that was highly classified at the time, it would only take one kamikaze or one plane to sink an entire battleship or an aircraft carrier. If we hadn't come up with those, we probably never would have made it through Midway.
Tell this deck gun here, it was the craziest story behind this one. A can company made it?
Yep. Everyone was in. It was all in. Everyone. Every single person. You were saving your waste fats to go back to ordnance. You were saving any of your scrap to go back to guns. You were saving any of your tires. Everyone was in on it, including the companies. That gun there was made by GM, Fisher Body Parts.
Wow.
This gun was made by a canning company in Chicago. So you find a lot of these guns that were made in 40, 41, 42, 43. They're made by companies you wouldn't think normally produce ordnance or guns, but everyone was in. It was all in from the base level, from the citizen to the corporation as well.
Wow. Ira, I appreciate your time. This has been a great segment of the show.
No problem. Enjoyed having you.
Yes. We're keeping history alive on History Highway. We'll be right back.
My crew keeps me on the road from episode to episode, 'cause they all know I got a million stories to tell. If I'm no dinosaur, it's cool to explore what makes a country great and put the crack in the Liberty Bell. So take a ride down the history highway. We're headed back to the days of old. So take a ride down the history highway. I got the pedal to the metal and I'm letting this Chevy roll. I got the pedal to the metal and I'm letting this Chevy roll.
To support Rick Revel's mission to preserve American history, go to the Mr. History YouTube page, and click on the Patreon button in the upper right corner of the page. Thank you in advance for your contribution.